Mongolia is perhaps the most fascinating country in the modern world. First of all, it's huge. It's more than twice the size of Texas, and if you placed it over the United States, it would basically cover the entire historical south of the country, spanning from Philadelphia in the east to Dallas in the west. But trapped in the middle of the Eurasian continent, Mongolia is surrounded on all of its sides by hundreds of kilometers of land separating it from the ocean, making it the largest landlocked country in the world that doesn't have access to an internal sea. And partially because of that and a whole bunch of other factors, Mongolia is quite literally the emptiest country on the planet. But Mongolia also has a pretty tiny population of just around 3.3 million people who live across all of that land, which is basically just the same amount of people as live around San Diego in California. Because of this, Mongolia's average population density is just at around 2.1 people per square kilometer of land, which is by far the absolute lowest of any sovereign country in the world. The capital and the largest city in Mongolia is here, Ulaanbaatar, and it's home to about 1.6 million people, which makes it actually a really big city. Ulaanbaatar is the core of the modern Mongolian state, and its population places it on a par with Barcelona in Spain for a similar number of people. But the fact that this big of a city exists within Mongolia means that Ulaanbaatar alone is home to roughly 48% of the entire Mongolian population. This makes Mongolia one of the most highly centralized countries in the entire world. And because Ulaanbaatar only takes up 0.3% of Mongolia's land, it means that you've got a situation in the country where 48% of the population, or 1.6 million people, all live on just 0.3% of the land, while the other 52% of the population, or 1.7 million people, all live across the remaining 99.7% of the land. This means that Ulaanbaatar's massively concentrated population greatly skews the average population density across the whole country. And so, when you exclude the city's land from the calculation, the remaining 99.7% of Mongolia contains an average population density of just 1.1 people per square kilometer, which is about 3 times emptier than Australia or Namibia both are on average. What is it about this country that has made it the emptiest in the entire world? To begin the explanation, you need to understand some things about Mongolia's geography and climate. You see, the country's territory exists across most of the High Mongolian Plateau, a region of high elevation across Central Asia that is contained on all of its sides by even higher mountain ranges. The elevation across the Mongolian Plateau ranges from 1,000 to 1,500 meters above sea level, and Mongolia's borders within the high plateau place it nearly 800 kilometers away from the nearest oceanic body of water, the Yellow Sea. So, because of the Mongolian Plateau's high elevation and distance away from the Indo-Pacific deep within the Eurasian continental interior, then every single year, this collection of very cold and dry Siberian air and high atmospheric pressure gets transferred across northern Eurasia, and particularly gets pushed into the Mongolian Plateau, which means that winters in Mongolia are nearly always very cold and very dry. All of Mongolia's rivers and lakes will freeze over during the brutal winters because of this phenomenon, and many of the smaller rivers will freeze solid down to their bottom, which makes Mongolia's rivers and lakes not very useful for transportation or irrigation throughout most of the year. Ulaanbaatar, the capital and the largest city, is only free of frost for around 3.5 months of the year between the middle of May and the end of August. And the city's average annual temperature is just negative 2.9 degrees Celsius, or about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which makes Ulaanbaatar the coldest capital city on the planet. But that fact hides the reality that during the short Mongol summers, temperatures can also soar into unbelievable highs of up to 38 degrees Celsius or 100 Fahrenheit in the southernmost regions of the country, and even 33 degrees Celsius or 91 Fahrenheit in the capital. To the south, the towering Himalayas and the Kunlun Shan Mountains block rain coming in from that direction. To the west, the Altai Mountains do the same, in addition to the Mongol Altai and Gobi Altai sub-ranges further to the south. Moisture-rich winds blowing in from these directions pass over those mountains first and mostly deposit their moisture as snowfall on the sides of those mountains facing away from Mongolia. Then, the winds are mostly dry by the time they blow over the Mongolian Plateau. And throughout the whole winter between September and April, the dry and cold and high-pressure air that blows into and then sits over the Mongolian Plateau from Siberia forces away any low-pressure, moist, and potentially rainy air, which keeps the skies clear and cloud-free throughout the whole season. This is why Mongolia is actually one of the sunniest countries in the world, and averages around 257 very sunny and cloud-free days a year. Because of all these factors, only about 0.4% of Mongolia's vast amount of land is is even considered arable and suitable for crop cultivation and agriculture. Despite being the 18th largest country in the world by overall amount of land, Mongolia also has less available arable land than Albania has got, a country that is more than 54 times smaller in overall area. That simply means that developing a large-scale settled agricultural society across the Mongolian plateau is, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Instead, the vast and wide-open empty steppes covered in grasses are far more ideally suited for herding and ranching livestock, which can more easily move around than settled farms and cities can. Nomadic herders can quickly take their livestock, families, and gurs across the flat steppe to different areas more suited to the seasons. During the winter, herders will gather their livestock in valleys where the mountains around them protect them from the cold Siberian winds. And then during the summer, they'll relocate to the wide-open, grass-covered steppes to better feed their herds. This is all why, since time immemorial now for thousands of years, the people of the Mongolian plateau have predominantly always been nomadic herders, and still to this day, about 65% of Mongolia's land is used for pasturage and herding animals. There are many recent man-made problems that have only exacerbated the long-standing climate problems to Mongolia's ability to raise livestock and contain people. Throughout most of the 20th century, Mongolia was ruled by an authoritarian communist regime that heavily regulated the size of livestock herds that were allowed in the country, which maintained an element of ecological balance. But after the communist regime suddenly collapsed in the 1990s, the economy became rapidly deregulated and a capitalist open market economy quickly took over in its place. This simultaneously happened just as the global demand for cashmere wool in the fashion industry began really taking off in the 1990s. Today, the global cashmere industry is a multi-billion-dollar business, and seeking to get in on the lucrative trend, many Mongolian herders recently freed from the legal regulations of the communist era began switching from traditional sheep herds to goat herds that actually produce cashmere wool. And over time, Mongolia would rise to become the second largest producer of cashmere fibers in the world, providing around 40% of the entire global supply today. But doing so also came at a steep ecological cost. Goats, you see, are much worse for the steppe environment of Mongolia than sheep are, because goats will more severely damage the grasses that they feed on. Goats will nibble at the roots of grasses while they eat, which prevents them from being able to grow back, while their sharper hooves in relation to sheep will further damage the upper layers of the soil, which will then be blown away by the omnipresent winds of the steppe. This phenomenon is leading to overall greater instances of dust storms, air pollution, and droughts across the country, which is making herding even more challenging than it was before. This, combined with the effects of global climate change, mean that the inhospitable Gobi Desert is steadily expanding northwards deeper into Mongolia at a rate of about 6 to 7 kilometers a year, and is thus steadily decreasing the amount of land in the country that is available to the nomadic herders. Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, and for generations afterwards, the Mongols and their horses thundered all across and around the Eurasian steppe, conquering everything in their wake. And in so doing, they carved out the largest contiguous land empire ever seen in human history, spanning at its zenith from China and Korea in the east to Iran in the south and to much of Russia, Ukraine, and Poland in the west. But over time from this apex, the empire quickly began steadily splintering into different sections as infighting between the Mongols themselves began to take hold. The Mongol Yuan dynasty would continue ruling over China for nearly another century until 1368, when they were subsequently overthrown by the Han-led Ming dynasty. The Mongols who once ruled China then retreated back towards the Mongolian plateau of their ancestors and formed a rump state known as the Northern Yuan, which largely spanned over the modern-day country of Mongolia, Inner Mongolia that's a part of China today, and parts of southern Siberia that now belong to Russia. The Mongols, similar to many of the Native Americans, had never lived in cramped, sedentary cities with their livestock and were permanently nomadic and on the go across the steppe. Many of Mongolia's nomadic herders began dedicating their sons and their families to the various Buddhist monasteries, either out of personal religious conviction or in order to gain the favor of the preeminent legal and economic power of the steppe. By the early 20th century, there were hundreds of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries all across Mongolia, and an estimated 1 in 3 of all the men in the country were dedicated Buddhist monks who had sworn themselves to a life of celibacy, forsaking wives and children. That essentially meant that 1 in 3 men in the country had removed themselves from the dating and reproductive pool, placing even further constraints on the ability of the population to grow. By the 1940s, virtually every Buddhist monk in the country had either been a communist or had apostatized from their faith. Only one monastery in the whole country was allowed to remain open in the capital, and only 100 monks were allowed to maintain it throughout the rest of the communist era into 1990. The birth rate steadily increased in the country and peaked during the 1970s, when the average Mongolian woman was having 7.3 children.